Hey everyone, I just played Heartworm, and I'm torn. Developed by Vincent Adinolfi and published by DreadXP, it already faced an uphill battle with me prior to release, given every time I saw anything about it, I thought, this smells of everything being a dream. And once it released, it left a really bad first impression by crashing so hard during the opening cinematic that I had to power cycle my computer. Although given that's happened once or twice since, I think it might have been a sign my PC's on its way out, and Heartworm just caught a very unlucky stray in the process. Either way, I stuck with it, because it's one of the few indie titles in recent memory to not only successfully, but faithfully pull off that old school PS1 survival horror aesthetic, and now having finished it, I find myself conflicted. Like 2021's Alyssa, Heartworm feels as though it fell through a wormhole right out of 1999 into the 2020s, and also like Alyssa, I mean that in every good and bad way you can imagine, so let's talk about it. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, there are going to be mild mechanical spoilers and big spiders throughout the video, so this is your warning. Spider timestamps can be found in the description. I'll put up a spoiler break when we get into the finer details of the plot. Alright, let's get to it. This is Heartworm.
Sometimes I wonder if I spend more time thinking about death than the average person.
Heartworm feels like something out of a dream, and I mean that as both a compliment and a criticism. It just has that vibe, that weird sense that something's slightly off in dreams, where the night is a bit too dark, or familiar spaces twist apart, or it feels like you're being watched despite the fact you're completely alone. I sometimes dream about playing games that don't exist, that remix bits and pieces from titles that actually do into something half-formed and ephemeral, and Heartworm feels like that. To the point, at one or two moments, I genuinely thought about pinching myself just to check. It's a triumph of art direction, and especially game feel. A lot of indie horror games take on the aesthetic of the PS1 era, but very few let it get so crunchy. Heartworm features a real-time, fully three-dimensional environment, but somehow Adinolfi found a way to make it look pre-rendered. It's not quite as crunchy as the backgrounds from Fear Effect, but it's close enough to trick the eye. There were some areas that felt crushed down to two-dimensional images even, like something right out of Resident Evil, and this effect persisted even when I turned off the retro visual style, which you can do upon hitting New Game. The interactive elements of the game, like Sam, the player character, and the items and enemies and puzzles are sharpened into focus with the modern graphics enabled, but the environments kept that ethereal pre-rendered quality, and I have no idea how he pulled it off. This is witchcraft. I love it. Heartworm nails the colour palette too. Many of the OG survival horror games were bright and almost garish in spite of the genre. They kind of had to be to make things pop out of the crunchy pre-rendered backgrounds, but it was also the style of the time. The 1990s was an era of bold colours and clunky tech, and Heartworm has both in spades. It's even got the classic door transitions, though only sometimes, which I don't really understand. Either give me a transition or make me walk all the way down this thing. No half measures, Heartworm. What the original slate of survival horror games didn't often have was darkness, an aspect of presentation that Heartworm is much more willing to dive right into. Take the contrast between the road leading up to the abandoned house at the start of the game and the interior. Holy shit. This is incredible, and it didn't matter whether the game was showing off some twisted interpretation of a real-world place, or something impossible out of a nightmare. Heartworm consistently wowed me with its visuals. The animations were great too, though I must say Sam's low-health run definitely skews a little closer to comedy than horror. But otherwise she, the enemies, and the moving puzzle elements all had a really satisfying retro flow to them. My one criticism of the visuals is that the camera placement could sometimes get a bit confusing. I love fixed camera angles in survival horror games, and I think Heartworm uses them really well, but only about 50% of the time. There are so many top-down or distant angles where Sam or the pickups are reduced to like 3 or 4 pixels each, that make it hard to see what you're doing, or if you're stuck on an obstacle too small to make out from so far away. These sorts of distant angles can work, they convey scale, they make you feel like you're being watched, but they also make it hard to see where you're going. I much preferred the closer, tighter angles that kept the focus on Sam and introduced an air of claustrophobia, the way the 90s originals did. Thanks to the way combat works, how it zooms in for an over-the-shoulder aim down sights by default, the distant camera angles weren't as frustrating as they could have been, but I did think they were a little overused. Oh god, not again. And I don't even want to think about what combat would be like with that option turned off. The sound was pretty good too. I enjoyed how crisp the camera was. I liked the bleeps and bloops of the menus. Nothing particularly stood out, but nothing really held it back either.
I remember coming to this lookout on a field trip to learn about the stars. Huh. 12:15.
Except maybe the fact that the footsteps seemed a little out of sync with the animation. But as long as you don't look at Sam's boots that much, it's not something you'll really notice. It's fine. Speaking of Sam, she's well voiced.
Hey. Sorry you haven't heard from me in a while. I've been busy, trying to find out about this place. You're not gonna believe me, and I don't even know if I really believe it myself, but I guess a part of me must, because I'm going.
I think the actress found a good balance between 90s survival horror camp and actual nuance, which is no small feat given how silly the game can sometimes get.
Well, that was disconcerting.
I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. One thing that definitely fucking did stick out is how much of the music not only evokes, but is a classic track from Resident Evil. The classic Spencer Mansion music from the original Resident Evil is everywhere in Heartworm. And so is the RPD theme from Resident Evil 2. Even the butt trumpets got a nod with this track of piss piano. They loop really harshly too. But the Direct references don't stop with the music. There is one room in the late game that is quite literally just the Spencer Mansion stairwell from Resident Evil, with nothing changed. The stairs are in the same place, the doors are largely in the same place, the decor is a little darker but the style is the same. When I ran up to the door under the stairs, I thought to myself, I swear to God if this leads to a save room, I'm gonna lose it, because the same door led to a save room in Resident Evil, and when it did in Heartworm 2, you better believe I fucking lost it. There are other examples of Heartworm copying Resident Evil's homework, though nothing so blatant, and while I wouldn't call it outright plagiarism, it did absolutely stick out. It did definitely stop Heartworm from finding its own identity in my eyes, from standing on its own 2 feet, because I felt it was constantly trying to evoke the titles that inspired it. Remember this? Remember this? Yeah, I do. It's distracting. Show me something new. It's not even a case of insecurity on Heartworm's part, because at other times, it's very confident in both level design and audio visuals, like how you enter one area through the attic window of an upside-down house, or this abandoned library in the middle of the woods, or this flooded hallway covered with crying masks. These are striking images in a game full of striking images, and they're representative of the underlying themes too. They actually do give Heartworm a sense of self that's separate from the giants of the genre that preceded it, but the callbacks just muddy the waters. I get the developer has a lot of love for the classics, I do too, but all the references did here was have me comparing Heartworm to those classics almost constantly, and with the exception of the environments, I found it often came up short. This is why I said it feels like a dream, because like those non-existent games I've conjured up myself, Heartworm 2 smashes familiar bits of earlier works whole and largely unchanged into itself in a way that, once awake, just come off as distracting. As are the cutscenes, though in a very different way. Heartworm is often quiet and abstract in its visuals, so I find it very funny that often the cinematics devolve into action schlock where Sam is tossed around by big boss monsters or chased by regular enemies. It's a tonal clash that the game never really resolves, and a lot of the time I found myself wishing there were no enemies at all. Much as Heartworm often wanted me to think of Resident Evil or Silent Hill, I found myself drawn to games like Gone Home or Sagebrush, because spiritually it feels much closer to a walking simulator than any 1990s classic of the horror genre. The enemies just feel present because it's a survival horror game, but even in terms of tone, it's more of a drama than anything else. The opening section in the abandoned house definitely has some horror vibes, but once you get into the actual meat of the game, they more or less disappear in favour of what I can only describe as survival sadness. The game has a quiet, melancholy mood that I think would land better without the presence of enemies, if it was just Sam alone in this strange place, made up of her fractured memories. Though that might just be because I didn't vibe with the enemy designs. They're kind of basic, and they follow the standard survival horror enemy roster of guy, dog, big, bug, and fast. Only the weeping angels from the woods and a late-game enemy that I won't spoil actually felt thematically appropriate, and, in the latter's case, even reintroduced a little horror into the game. The others were just sort of there. That said, the giant spider scuttling across the overpass can fuck right off. I'd probably be more forgiving of the enemies if the combat weren't so basic. Instead of a gun, you have a camera with which to add the enemies to Sam's cringe collection, which is fine. I don't have a problem with it in concept, it's the execution that's frustrating. Very few of the enemies react to being caught in 480p. There's no heft to the act of dealing out damage, or especially killing them. There are no impact frames or big animations to let you know you're hurting them. You just snap some pics and eventually they fall over. It's just a bit flaccid overall, and to be be fair, the enemies are no better. Heartworm is an easy game. I only died once, and it was on purpose to see how much damage Sam could take. The answer is a lot, and it didn't help that the dogs consistently missed their attacks. At times, it almost felt like the enemies were nerfed for the sake of people unfamiliar with tank controls. But then there were other moments where I ended up stun-locked and almost beaten to death before I could get off a single attack, so I don't know. The weird thing is, it doesn't feel jank the way Alyssa did. The combat's smooth enough, there are no real problem enemies, it's just so safe and simple that outside of the boss fights, it was pretty forgettable. And the bosses are only memorable because holy shit, they are schmoving. It doesn't help that there's very little depth to the combat. Early on you can find a camera mod that gives you a free photo burst with every press of the button, and I figured I was going to find more as the game went on, but that was the only upgrade I came across. It's the only one you'll need too. It trivialized the combat for the rest of the game, and it was already pretty simple. Maybe there are others hidden away, but to me it feels like combat was just included because it's expected of a retro survival horror game, rather than because it adds anything to the experience. The exploration and the puzzles were a lot better in my opinion. Again, they're not too hard, but they are satisfying. The visual style had me wanting to seek out every corner of every area to see what was there, and I was rarely disappointed by what I found. The map screen was a little confusing at times. Single rooms are sometimes shown as multiple spaces, and the inverse was also sometimes true. Static covers rooms you haven't cleared out yet, but it's often hard to tell what the game counts toward that completion, like if flavor text contributes or not. It keeps a record of important quest areas, like where you'll find a candle you need to light for a puzzle, which is good, but it doesn't tell you where Sam is in the room, which is bad, especially given how convoluted a few areas can be. The little yellow doorway symbols and the way they connect between areas was hard to pass too, since the red lines occasionally run underneath other rooms and make it difficult to tell what exit leads where. I once got stuck at a late game puzzle for ages, not because it was too hard, but because I couldn't find the door to the room with the hint. Organically exploring the place always felt great, but having to rely on the map at the end of it all sucked. To be fair, I don't know how you could fix it, but the way it is now definitely dragged. That was the only time I got stuck at a puzzle though. The rest of them were really intuitive, though a bit too simple for my liking. I more enjoyed their creativity, like the one at the baseball field where you have to do a home run, or a late game slide puzzle where you have to examine parts of the environment to figure out where each tile has to go. Solving one usually gets you a hint for another, and they're incorporated into the environments really well. It all still runs on Resident Evil nonsense logic, but given the dreamlike atmosphere of the game, that actually makes sense. Sure, putting a baseball on a stand to open a plaque to get a model train to retrieve a key from inside a diorama is silly, but it ties into Heartworm's backstory, and it fits the genre. Best of all, the crate puzzles are kept to an absolute minimum. There was never even a point where I found myself out of inventory space. It's balanced really well, especially if you go out of your way to find the game's one and only inventory upgrade. As with the camera mods, I felt like I was going to get a couple more camera bags throughout the game, but again, this was the only one, and, as with the burst mod for the camera, it was the only one I needed. I found them very close together, and I almost wonder if they were placed there early on in development with the expectation that more would be added later, but then the project had to be scaled down in order to be finished within budget or by a deadline, and they were just left in as remnants because they were already done. Because the tutorial messages do imply there are more mods to be found, and the late game feels like a mishmash of areas intended to be whole sections like the town and the woods, rather than mere wings of the final dungeon. No game makes it out the door without some sort of compromise, and to be fair, after the early game these weird remnants disappear, but it still stuck out to me. And speaking of the tutorials, I found them really intriguing. intrusive. They feel like a last-minute addition, which is weird because some of what they show is clearly from an earlier iteration of the game, but given they're also only present early on, it's not a deal-breaker. What kind of is goes back to my criticism of the game's references to the classics. Heartworm is a very good iteration on the retro survival horror formula, but it doesn't innovate, and I'm not saying it has to reinvent the genre like Resident Evil 4 did, but Heartworm just has nothing of its own, no mechanical or thematic hook to set it apart from not only the classics, but its fellow indie throwbacks. Resident Evil didn't just codify the genre, it offered mechanical depth to combat with weapon and ammo types, and multiple player characters. Silent Hill took a psychological folksy approach to its horror. Alyssa added complexity with a bunch of different costumes, and a dark fairy tale twist. Signalis has a built-in radio that's utilised in fights, in puzzles, in secret hunting. Even lesser-known titles like Martian Gothic put its own spin on things with having to keep 3 separate characters alive in real time, for better or worse. Heartworm just doesn't have anything like that, which is frustrating because it very easily could have. One of the first mechanics you're introduced to is the camera flash. If you press the attack button without aiming, a flash will light up the area around Sam. And when you first do it in this extremely dark room at the back of an abandoned house, it's chilling. It's such a fantastic idea that opens up so many possibilities. And yet, after this point, Heartworm does nothing with it. A lot of the game is so bright that you'll never even need the flash anyway. I just kept doing it to see it light up the environments even more. It's such a disappointment because it's so easy to see how this flash mechanic could be built into horror set pieces. How you could have a completely dark area full of enemies that freeze in the light, or a terrifying spectacle only revealed once you hit the flash. The anticipation that builds between button presses when you're trapped in the dark and forced to imagine what might be there waiting for you when you next hit the flash is some of the most effective horror in a game I've played all year, and Heartworm squanders the possibility within the first 30 minutes. That frustration extends to the writing as well. I said before Heartworm gave off "it was all a dream" vibes prior to release, which I really hoped I was wrong about because everything turning out to be in the main character's head is one of the most basic boring plot twists in all of fiction. I'm happy to say the events of Heartworm don't turn out to be a dream, but only just. It is like one toe over the line. So, you know, points for that. But otherwise, in terms of plot, Heartworm met my expectations exactly, for better and worse. One of my biggest questions going in was, what goal is Sam working toward? Why are we here? And the answer is, you just kind of are. The goal is to escape the nightmare, but there's no real urgency to it. Survival horror games are usually pretty slow compared to other genres, but Heartworm is content to take it very easy indeed. Sometimes that pacing worked for me, like in the woods. Sometimes it didn't, as in the town. Overall, I would have preferred the stakes to be a little bit higher than they were, though. It has a fun hook at least. It begins like a good creepypasta, with Sam travelling to an abandoned house where it's said the walls of reality run thin, and you can cross over into the realm of the dead, after hearing about the place from a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who also went there too. The only catch is, none who have ventured to the place have ever returned. But the threat of being lost forever in this nowhere space isn't enough to keep Sam from going. She's trapped in her grief, and she's looking for answers, and nothing is going to get in her way. And that's about the most plot you get until the ending cinematic. Heartworm is a journey more than it is a story, taking Sam through nightmare versions of places familiar to her like her childhood home, or the woods where she and her grandfather used to go hiking, and it works. The places feel sufficiently otherworldly, even without the impossible architecture. Like I said, it's just got that dreamlike vibe. Sam does work through some shit as you come across specific places, and you do find notes from someone who came before you detailing their own descent into the nightmare, but you never really encounter anyone in the present tense of the plot. In that regard, Heartworm does differ from the classics. You never meet other grieving people searching for closure in their own versions of the nightmare. It's just Sam alone with her demons throughout, which is part of the reason I wish there were no enemies. That constant isolation would hit so much harder if Sam really was alone. Aside from journal entries, you can find poems, some by real people like Hermann Hesse, others made for the game itself, and they all speak to the underlying theme that death is hard for the living. Sam herself is terrified of death. That's part of the reason she's willing to risk it all travelling to the house, ironically enough. She has to know what lies beyond the veil, if anything. She has to find the one she's lost, whatever the cost, however deep down the rabbit hole it takes her. And that's about all I can say without getting into spoilers, so if you don't want to learn the big twist at the, heart of Heartworm, go to here.
I came all the way out here not knowing if I'll get the answers I need. I just hope it's worth it.
Okay, you ready? Heartworm's big twist is that there is no twist. Yeah, the whole game I kept expecting Sam or the Nightmare to drop some bombshell that she's terrified of death because she herself is dying, perhaps from Heartworm given the title, or she's desperate to get closure on the passing of a loved one because she feels in some way responsible. But no, she's just really scared of death. And that's fine. As the game went on and the theme of life is what you make of it, so you should use your time, bubbled up to the surface, I did start to appreciate the journey more than I expected I would. This isn't about Sam confronting some horrible secret or inevitability. It's about finding catharsis after the loss of a loved one, along with the strength to keep on living. Heartworm feels like a very personal work in that regard, as though the process of making it was itself part of the developer's own grieving process, though that's just speculation on my part. Certainly the Nightmare's ponderings on imposter syndrome and Sam's responses to them feel very reflective of the author's own thoughts, and I can sympathise because I experience all those things too. But as with the mechanics, it's all just so surface level. There's no nuance to it. It's not a narrative hook that can be played straight anymore. Not when so much psychological horror is built around the trauma of grief. Silent Hill 2 wouldn't be the classic of survival horror that it is if it was only about James Sunderland's grieving process. And the ruminations on imposter syndrome are especially funny at times because, like I mentioned before, Heartworm does occasionally just outright copy bits from the games it desperately wants to live up to. Heartworm nailed the style, but it lacks the substance which made the classics and many of the modern indie throwbacks so compelling. Which brings to mind The Evil Within more than anything. There's even a moment where a giant spider monster attacks the main character riding a bus, and the spider's presence makes just as much sense here as it did in The Evil Within. That game's problem was that it was trying to be every horror genre at the same time. There was no coherence. Nothing seemed representative of anything unless you dived into the deep lore. Heartworm isn't that bad. I understand why the game chose the locations it did and the enemies within them, but when it comes to the spider, I've got nothing. And again, the tonal shift to action schlock really doesn't fit the mood. Even the endings play it safe. I only found 2 of the 3, and the one I didn't get presumably ends with Sam trapped in the nightmare given it's called the stay ending, but both leave endings don't really build to anything. Sam just wakes up from the nightmare and goes home having worked through her grief, and in the better version she now has an extra friend, and I just don't think that's enough for such a common narrative hook. The fact the hooded figure chasing you throughout the game is also someone who got lost in the nightmare looking for answers, and some of the enemies seem to be Sam interpreted through TV static, make me wonder if another underlying theme of Heartworm is grief grief can make us into monsters, but if so, it's vague at best, and still lacks a real meaty shock to make it land, a la the Red Queen from American McGee's Alice, turning out to be a manifestation of the main character's own guilt. The game needed a twist to bring it together. It needed more than the seemingly unconnected imagery of floods, and libraries, and clocks, and TV static. It needed cohesion. And I understand saying that about a dream is silly, but without something deeper to hold the plot together, or back it up in some way, the whole thing comes off a bit as baby's first grieving process. And I don't mean that to be callous. Everyone grieves differently and all those different ways are valid. I'm more talking about it from a specifically narrative perspective here. I'm sure someone's going to play this game and it's going to help them work through some shit. I hope it does. But it wasn't enough for me. There are a bunch of costumes to unlock, a couple of them surprisingly horny given the otherwise dour tone of the game, and collectible opossums to find, so the game does offer some replayability beyond the different endings, but I don't think I'll be going back to Heartworm again. It very narrowly avoided consignment to the garbage bin of "it was all a dream" stories, but there's still not enough narrative or mechanical weight to bring me back. In terms of presentation, it's one of the best retro survival horror games I've played, and for a largely solo project, it's extremely impressive. It's also pretty long for a retro survival horror game. It ran me up just under 8 hours, despite the in-game clock claiming I completed it in half that time. So if you're a fan of the genre, there's a lot here for you to sink your teeth into. I'm definitely curious to see what Vincent Adinolfi does next, but it's just too ephemeral, too dreamlike, too easy to forget upon its end. Heartworm spends so much time calling back to Resident Evil and Silent Hill that, ultimately, I feel like it forgot to be itself. Thanks for watching. And that's the video. Before I go, I'd like to thank by name the people supporting me with $5 US a month or more on Patreon. Abril, Azazel, Cass, Hawkwing2652, Heymatey, Jeffiet, Kim, Marcy May, Operator Error, Paranoid Android, Roughbelly, Sminglis, Sarah Bloomer, Smorsky, Sneezy McGlassface, Space Quest Historian, This Sauerkraut, Tree Free Angry Bees, Ursa, and Zeke the Phantom. Thank you so much. This video and everything I make for the channel is now made possible by their generous support. I don't make money off ads and I don't take sponsors. So if you like what I do and want to see more, please consider donating. And if you can't support monthly or just don't want to give Patreon money, Ko-Fi is also an option. But if financial support isn't possible and you still want to help the channel out, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share the video around because YouTube sure won't. Links are in the description. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.